Greetings, my name is Dan Modell. About a year and a half ago, I began a project to commemorate the 65th anniversary of the flood that struck the Santa Cruz area on December 22nd, 1955. I entitled my project A Flood of Memories. I conducted interviews and collected photos in hopes of putting together a big event at the library in downtown Santa Cruz. While the pandemic altered those plans, I was determined that the story of the flood be told. It's a story of pain and loss, but also a story of heroism and of the community coming together in ways that make me proud to call myself a Santa Cruzian. My presentation will focus on the impact of the flood on downtown Santa Cruz, but there are many flood stories beyond the scope of my presentation today. From the impact of the flood on the communities in the Santa Cruz Mountains to the loss of Santa Cruz's last Chinatown. I can only hope others will step up and give these stories the attention they so richly deserve. My presentation today will come in two parts. The first, a 20-minute documentary film on the flood. The second, two in-depth interviews of local residents who experienced the flood firsthand. I hope you find their stories as interesting as I have. Lastly, I want to explain that I'm putting together an archive of information on the flood to be kept at the Museum of Art and History here in Santa Cruz. If you would like to contribute to the archive, or if you have any questions or comments about my work, please contact me at eastsidehistory, one word, @gmail.com. Now, without further ado, I give you A Flood of Memories, the Flood of 55. The mighty San Lorenzo River. The San Lorenzo stretches some 29 miles from its headwaters in Castle Rock State Park to its mouth by the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. The river has been a focal point since Spanish explorers first discovered it in 1769. Over the ensuing years, it has served many purposes. During the 1800s, the river functioned as a power source for the many mills on the river, as well as playing an important role in the California powder works in the hills outside of Santa Cruz. In 1885, 3 Hawaiian princes first introduced surfing to the mainland with their historic rides at the San Lorenzo River mouth. From 1895 until 1927, the San Lorenzo was the site of the Venetian Water Carnival. Without question, the San Lorenzo River had a special place in the hearts of many Santa Cruzians. Despite this fact, the river brought with it one challenge: flooding. This had been an issue from the beginning. In 1791, floodwaters forced the first Spanish settlers to move the site of the Santa Cruz Mission to higher ground, what would become known as Mission Hill. Across the river, the town of Branciforte was also founded on higher ground, away from the river. However, by the 1840s, the benchlands, or flats as they were known, were beginning to be developed, with a man named Elihu Anthony leading the way. Flooding of residences and businesses near the river would become a regular occurrence. As you can see, this is the flood of 1931. The camera is facing east across the river to San Lorenzo Boulevard and the Barson Orchard, just above the Riverside Avenue Bridge. In fact, as Santa Cruz grew, flooding became a real problem, especially between 1938 and 1941, when the San Lorenzo flooded 3 times in 4 years. People complained, but Mayor Hinkle responded the city didn't have the funds for a levee system. Federal assistance wasn't available till after World War II, at which point a variety of proposals were put forth. Ideas varied in style and price point. Some even suggested creating a flood control lagoon. In the spring of 1954, the Army Corps of Engineers applied to Congress for $2.26 million for a flood control project on the lower San Lorenzo. With 16 recorded floods in about 90 years, you could say flood control was an idea whose time had come. Despite the flood danger, the San Lorenzo remained, at times, an idyllic place, well into the 1950s. It was one of the most popular fishing rivers in the state, and even paddle boats could be seen plying the river.
And when Blessing and I drove by the river and saw the paddle boats, we couldn't resist trying one. Even a nautical dub can navigate a trim craft like this. It's just like riding a bicycle, except that you don't have to worry about balancing it.
Yes, idyllic best describes it. However, then came 1955. While Congress mulled over the idea of funding a levee system on the San Lorenzo, Mother Nature had her own plans. In 1955, early December brought a series of storms generated by a low-pressure system stretching all the way to Hawaii, which stalled over California due to a high-pressure system to the east. The result was torrential rain for many days. Santa Cruzans remember.
We woke up to rain, we went to sleep with rain, woke up with rain, went to sleep with rain.
It rained continuous for 22 days.
Over 20 inches of rain fell in Santa Cruz, but much more in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Eventually, the ground became saturated and the water had nowhere to go. Then on December 22nd, the mountains had particularly heavy rain, with over 9 inches recorded in Boulder Creek in a 24-hour period. The result was a night few who were there would ever forget. From Swanton up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, where mudslides turned deceptively named Little Creek into a raging torrent, to Soquel, where debris building up around the bridge over Soquel Creek caused the creek to jump its banks and flow through town. But the stories of the damage that the San Lorenzo River wrought on downtown Santa Cruz were particularly harrowing. It was around 10 p.m. on the night of December 22nd that flooding was first reported in downtown Santa Cruz. Word came from residents of the El Rio Trailer Park on River Street, on the northern fringe of the downtown area, that the river had jumped its banks and was entering the park.
I remember being woken up by my father, and we opened the door, and the water was right up to the threshold. And so he put us on his back and waded us out. And then he went back to help with a lot of the older people that couldn't get out. The marks inside the trailer were about a foot from the ceiling. That's how high the water got.
But what of the other El Rio residents? The lucky ones were able to find shelter and ride out the flood in a house by the El Rio entrance. The less fortunate? They had to climb through the vents in the ceilings of their trailers, up onto their roofs, waiting for rescue. They could only watch as the floodwaters turned over trailers and uprooted trees. Meanwhile, elsewhere downtown,
telephone lines were starting to go out from the water, and then the water started coming through the office on Pacific, and it was coming through at about, 2-3 feet. But the manager of the Palomar Hotel, a fellow by the name of Gillette Stanford, had decided to protect the glass of the doors on the arcade, so he opened them on Front Street, and so that created kind of a stream. So while we were in about 2 or 3 feet of water, we saw this 4 to 5 foot of water coming out of the arcade, going across the street, slamming into the front of the bakery over there, the S&M bakery, and then going on down the street. In fact, I remember Nash made a car at that time called the Nash Metropolitan. It was a little boxy car, and I can remember seeing the car moving in the parking space from the water lifting it up. He was just watching, look at the car, it's on its own. Everything in the world was floating down the river, down the street. Because in those days, Front Street was Auto Row.
Right.
And so tires and, all kinds of things from all of those auto dealers was flowing, and some of it got thrown in, got sucked into the Palomar Arcade, and then was floating down Pacific Avenue. There was all kinds of debris floating around.
Indeed, local merchants and their employees did their best to cope with the floodwaters. Some moved stock to higher shelves. Others barricaded doors or drilled holes in floors so the water would drain into their basements. Sandbaggers did what they could with available supplies. Local car dealers moved cars to higher ground.
And my sister, who was 14, got to drive the cars, and I just talked to her the other day. She thought that was the greatest thing going, that she got to drive cars and park them up on Beach Hill.
Despite such efforts, many stores had stock ripped from their shelves by the floodwaters. By the next day, Christmas presents to cars could be found down at the local beaches if they hadn't disappeared into the bay altogether. Here's one first-hand account of the river that night.
At least 50, 60, 70 yards wide, maybe 100 yards wide of just water coming and trees coming. And they were big trees. They were maybe 20 feet long, like this, getting sucked under the bridge. They would hit the bridge, and if they went horizontal with it,
they get stuck.
But if they came through nose first, they got sucked under, and they would shoot up the other side. It was powerful.
Meanwhile, on the east side of the river, residents weren't faring much better, particularly along May Avenue and Dakota Avenue, both of which bordered Branciforte Creek. Some would come to refer to the area where Branciforte Creek and the San Lorenzo came together as the Triangle of Death. Joan Cunningham was 14 years old at the time. She lived on Dakota Avenue, and during the evacuation, she got left behind with her 3-year-old niece. When it didn't appear anyone was coming back anytime soon, she took matters into her own hands and tried to swim to safety.
Kind of a dead-end space between the last house and the next house going towards the ocean. And the water was swirling through pretty quickly. It was an outlet for the water coming out of the river, the creek, which had turned into a river. And I was scared to death. I had this little 3-year-old cousin on my shoulders, and I thought, we're going to do this, I'm going to do it. And so I challenged myself and went across that. It was probably 14 feet across to the next side of the road there. And we made it up to Ocean Street, and there were people there, and I don't remember a whole lot from that point. It was pretty traumatic, but I remember people being there, and they helped me and my niece out of the water.
Indeed, Joan was probably pulled to safety by some of the many heroes of that night. Residents worked hand in hand with local law enforcement, putting their own lives at risk as they made many trips by boat into local neighborhoods to rescue stranded residents. The next day, Army troops stationed at Fort Ord came to Santa Cruz's aid with duckboats and even helicopters.
I was too young to be afraid, but I remember hearing big logs coming down, from the mountains and hitting the house all night. So that was a little fearful. It could have knocked it off the foundation. Mm-hmm. Could have. And I'm sure my parents were up all night, obviously. The water came into our house on the bottom level up to 5 feet. Wow. So we were upstairs all night. My father finally realized the dog was out in the dog pen about 10 o'clock and went and rescued him. He was sitting on his doghouse that was floating.
Right.
So the next morning, the Army Corps of Engineers, or the military, one of the two, sent in tanks to rescue everybody on the river.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember being carried out, and by then the water level had gone down a little bit.
Was there still water in the house?
Oh yeah, and mud up to the walls. It may not have been the next day, but I think it was. Anyway, I remember being carried out by some big burly guy and put down the big chute in a tank. And there were bunches of people in there already, and it was kind of surreal, but you know, you're a little kid and you just kind of really don't know what's happening.
Speaking of saves, a fellow named Edgar Weaver had lived along the San Lorenzo. He was swept into the river when his house was overwhelmed by floodwaters. His home was destroyed as it went under the Soquel Avenue Bridge. However, Mr. Weaver survived and was able to pull himself onto an island in the middle of the San Lorenzo River, just south of the Riverside Avenue Bridge. After being stranded there for about 5 hours, a helicopter from Fort Ord came, landed on the island, and rescued him. Mr. Weaver was lucky to have only suffered from shock and exposure as a result of the ordeal. That was just one of many spectacular saves. Eventually, the floodwaters subsided, but the trouble was only beginning. Here's a first-hand account of what downtown Santa Cruz looked like the following morning.
Oh my God. We saw cars that were up on the, just turned over, just mud everywhere. The bakery was full of mud. I mean, it was closed, obviously, everything was closed. And then my dad just crept along a little bit, and we just didn't know what to think. It was like a war zone. We kind of could see where China was. Chinatown. Because it was not there anymore. It was just all underwater. And as you know, all the buildings were destroyed.
I remember one of the Salvation Army people came by, and I was outside, and she said to my mother, "You shouldn't be letting her play out here. It's unsanitary." And my mother said, "It's the same mud that's in the house."
While the destruction was everywhere, the cleanup included many stories of downtown businesses coming together to help one another.
All of the sanding equipment and motors for working the machinery for repairing shoes was all the motors were damaged. They got water in them. Where the Nickelodeon is now was a bakery. It was an Italian bakery. It was owned by a gentleman called Fred Conti. He was an Italian. He lived up in Bonnie Doon. And that bakery was known at the time for their Italian rum cakes. They were really good. But he made a suggestion to my father: take all the motors, unmount them, we'll wash them out, get the sand out of them, and we'll put them in the ovens, because he had ovens, bakery ovens that were big, right? Mm-hmm. We'll put them in the ovens and we'll bake them really slow and get the moisture out, see if we can salvage them. And lo and behold, they were salvaged.
In the end, a few businesses closed, including the Santa Cruz Theater. Others moved, particularly car dealers who sought higher ground on the east side and west side of town. Still other businesses were lost to the resulting redevelopment project, including the Garibaldi Hotel. Despite these losses, most businesses reopened, and for many people, life went on pretty much as usual. But what of the mighty San Lorenzo River? By the early 60s, the Army Corps of Engineers had transformed it into a shadow of its former self. Some termed their creation a drainage ditch. Most of the fish were unable to return to the new, improved river, and the San Lorenzo's reign as one of the top fishing rivers in the state came to an abrupt end. But there was some good news. The levee largely held against potential floods, including in 1982, when rising waters combined with debris damaged the Soquel Avenue Bridge, but spared the downtown. Still, the San Lorenzo moved from being the centerpiece of Santa Cruz to more of an afterthought. However, after years of neglect, Santa Cruzans are rediscovering the San Lorenzo River. Led by groups such as the Coastal Watershed Council, local residents have once again come to appreciate the river and better understand its role as part of local ecosystems. But what about the flood danger? The San Lorenzo River may not be as mighty as it once was, but from time to time it still rages. As recently as 2017, the benchlands by the Santa Cruz County building were inundated by floodwaters, but the levee protecting the downtown held, allowing life to go on pretty much undisturbed. While Santa Cruzans are learning to love their river again, some have forgotten the flood of '55 and the damage the San Lorenzo wrought on the downtown. But many of those who experienced the flood of '55 firsthand are still here, and they have a message.
Oh, important to know that certainly it could do it again. It was pretty important.
People got to remember that it can happen again. It can really happen again.
Yes, one of these winters, the San Lorenzo may again jump its banks and flow down Pacific Avenue, reminding Santa Cruzans of its destructive power. One can only wonder, when that day comes, will Santa Cruz be ready?